There's an old word for flying to Washington and asking a foreign government to help break up your country. It's treason. That's David Eby's word for what Alberta separatists are doing. And you know what? He's right.
These aren't random cranks yelling on a Facebook group. They're walking into U.S. government buildings talking about a $500 billion line of credit and workshopping how to carve Alberta out of Canada.
While they're doing that, Alberta's premier refuses to call it out. Danielle Smith has had every chance to say, not in my name, not in my province, and instead, she's worried about demonizing them.
And over the last week, even Doug Ford had to step in from a Pizza Nova in Etobicoke and say what the Premier of Alberta would not. Either you're with Canada or you're not. Going behind Canada's back and negotiating with the U.S. is unacceptable and unethical. Alberta separatists are not freedom fighters. They're a loud, well-funded minority trying to cash out on the rest of the country. And the real question isn't just, what are they doing in Washington? It's, why is Danielle Smith protecting them instead of protecting Alberta?
Because if these people ever got close to what they're selling, Albertans wouldn't wake up in some oil-soaked paradise. They'd wake up in a weaker country with worse health care, shaky pensions, and the political power of Puerto Rico in a bad mood.
So let's walk through how we got here, who is really behind this, and what Alberta stands to lose if this stunt isn't stopped. And we'll start in Ottawa at the First Minister's meeting that was supposed to show a united front, right up until the story broke about those quiet little trips to Washington.
So picture this: Ottawa, First Minister's meeting, Prime Minister Mark Carney, all the premiers trying to present a united front before the next round of trade talks with Donald Trump's White House.
The homework assignment is simple. Show Washington that Canada is not a clearance rack of provinces that they can pick through. You want our energy, our food, our minerals? You deal with Canada, not with premiers cutting side deals out of the back door.
And then a story drops in the Financial Times saying that the Trump administration has been holding covert meetings with Alberta separatists. Not Alberta, not the Alberta government, a separatist group called Stay Free Alberta that wants to rip the province right out of Canada.
Their unofficial leader, Jeff Rath, is bragging that they've been to Washington twice already. They're meeting with State Department officials, and they got a February meeting lined up with the U.S. Treasury. And he's out here talking about a $500 billion line of credit for a future independent Alberta.
These are not some random guys playing video games in the basement. These are people who are walking into U.S. government buildings, pitching a plan to break up Canada and put Alberta on the hook for a debt the size of our entire federal budget.
So, David Eby gets to the Premier's meeting, and reporters ask him about it. And he doesn't dance around it. He says if you go to a foreign country and ask for help breaking up your own country, well, there's an old word for that. It's treason. And it needs to be called out, and it needs to be stopped.
And you'd think at that moment, the Premier of Alberta would stand up and say, yeah, that's way over the line. I might disagree with Ottawa on a whole lot of things, but asking a foreign power to help us break up the country, that is not okay.
Instead, Danielle Smith looks at that and says that she's not going to demonize or marginalize roughly 1 million Albertans who are open to separation. Unless, of course, they're doctors, teachers, or First Nations. Then the language gets a whole lot sharper for some reason.
Listen, if this were any other movement flying off to Beijing or Moscow asking for loans and political backing to carve up Canada, every front page in the country would be screaming treason. The only reason that they think they can float it is because they're doing it in Washington and wrapping it in talk of allies instead of admitting what it really is: a foreign-backed effort to break up our own country.
And while Danielle Smith is talking about legitimate grievances, First Nations leaders in Alberta are holding a press conference saying that this petition for separation is an attack on treaties, on the Constitution, and on their rights.
7 chiefs, Treaty 6, Treaty 7, Treaty 8, saying this straight out. Under Canadian and international law, Alberta doesn't have a unilateral right to secede. Alberta is not a party to the treaties. The Crown is. You don't get to redraw the map without First Nations consent.
They're already in court. They're already seeking an injunction to stop the separatist petition from moving forward. And they're saying this whole thing invites foreign interference, increases racism, and puts Alberta at risk of becoming the 51st state.
One chief said it plainly. When the U.S. Treasury Secretary tells Alberta to come on down to the United States, that's not a joke. That's how they see this province right now, as something that they can peel off.
And here's the part that nobody wants to say out loud. This is not just controversial, and it's not just bad optics. When private citizens start holding quiet meetings with a foreign power about dismantling their own country, that's the territory that criminal law was written for.
We're not talking about throwing people in jail because they're mad at Ottawa. You can hate the feds all you want. You can vote them out. You can protest, because that's democracy.
But the second you cross the line into, let's go down to Washington, pitch a $500 billion line of credit, and talk through how to carve Alberta out of Canada, you're not just venting anymore. You are actively working on a plan to break up the country behind its back.
In any serious democracy, that's not a quirky side project. That's a national security file. That's the kind of thing that gets you a knock on the door from people with badges, not a friendly quote in the business section.
If this were happening in France or Germany or South Korea, and a group of citizens were sneaking off to a foreign capital to talk about breaking off a region, you know what? The whole world would hear about it. And the headlines? We all know what word they would use, and we all know what kind of investigations would follow.
Canada has laws against treason for a reason. We have foreign interference laws for a reason. They're not decorative. They're there exactly for this reason. People who think they can quietly negotiate the end of the country with another government and then stroll back through customs like it was a shopping trip.
If you want to change the Constitution, do it in the open. Make the case, run on it, face the voters. But if you're doing it in back rooms in Washington, you're not a patriot. You are betting against your own country. And at that point, yes, you should be worried about handcuffs, not high fives.
Now, let's talk about who is actually pushing separation, because this matters. The polling tells the story. On a good day for them, between 20 and 30% of Albertans say they would back independence. That means 7, maybe 8 out of 10 do not want to walk away from Canada. Most Albertans are not lining up to become a territory of Trump's Don Road doctrine.
So how do you get that 20% fired up enough to sign petitions and cheer on trips to Washington? Well, you feed them propaganda. Day after day. Ottawa is stealing from you. The rest of Canada hates you. The only way that we can be respected is to walk out.
Yep, you crank up talk radio, you flood Facebook with memes, you paint every federal program as an attack, every court ruling as a conspiracy, every treaty obligation as someone else's problem.
We've seen this movie before, everyone. South of the border, an entire country was told over and over that the system was rigged, the media was lying, the courts were corrupt, and only one man could save them.
They were told that elections they lost were stolen, that any check on power was an attack, and that their real enemies weren't foreign governments, but their allies.
And how did that turn out for them? Well, they've lost their health care, they have ICE running the streets, they are trillions of dollars in debt, their dollars dropping, and they have a president getting richer, lining his own pockets every day. And the people who believe their country doesn't exist unless their guy is in charge, well, they're losing their houses, their jobs, and their livelihoods. But they still won't denounce what Trump is doing. That's what years of propaganda buys you.
Now take that same formula and copy and paste it into Alberta. Then add in a U.S. administration that has gutted funding for environmental protection, clean water programs, and anything with the word climate in it, and that sees your province as a natural resource machine they'd love to bolt onto their grid. You don't get freedom out of that. What you get is dependency dressed up as liberation.
Listen, you're not signing up for some high standard clean water, clean air future. You're handing your rivers, your land, and your air to a government that can't even guarantee its own citizens safe drinking water.
So when we look at that 20%, we're not talking about millions of Albertans who woke up one morning with a fully developed constitutional plan. We're talking about people who have been deliberately worked on, by politicians, by media personalities, by foreign interests, until breaking up their own country starts to sound like common sense.
That doesn't make them villains, though. It makes them targets. The real villains are the ones aiming the fire hose of propaganda at them while they fly off to Washington to see what they can get for Alberta on the open market.
What we're seeing is a classic trick. You take a loud, well funded minority, you drape them in the language of the people, and then you use them as leverage, not just against Ottawa, but against your own province. They're not pitching a better health system or stronger schools or a fair economy. They're pitching a $500 billion line of credit from Washington. They're pitching new pipelines with fewer environmental rules. They're pitching access to U.S. markets without having to listen to national standards or constitutional rights.
And let's be clear about who pays for that. It's not the people on the private jets. It's the nurses, the rig workers, the students, the farmers, and the small business owners who wake up one day and find out that the province they live in has been turned into a bargaining chip.
First Nations leaders are already warning that this movement is dragging up open racism. They're seeing more confrontations, they're hearing more hostility, and they're very clear. They signed treaties to share this land, not to have a province try and walk off of it. Now, let's talk about what Alberta would actually look like if these separatists got anywhere close to their fantasy. Because they're selling people a postcard that looks nothing like what reality would be.
Right now, Albertans live in a country with universal health care. Is it perfect? No. Is it under strain? Absolutely. But behind that system is a National Health Act and billions of dollars in federal transfers that keep the doors open.
You blow up Confederation and walk out? Well, that federal money disappears. Alberta would have to build an entire health system as a standalone country, negotiate its own drug prices, staff its own hospitals, then do it all while bond markets are looking at a brand new state with no track record and a mountain of debt.
These guys talk like they're going to be Norway overnight. In reality, the financial markets are more likely to treat an independent Alberta like a risky startup with one product: oil. And you know what? That product is in a world that is slowly moving away from it.
And then there's the pensions, right? Right now, Albertans are part of a Canada-wide system. You leave, you either have to cut a deal with Ottawa or build a new one from scratch. Either way, retirees become hostages in a political fight they didn't even sign up for.
Trade? Half of Alberta's exports go to the rest of Canada. You turn Canada into a foreign country and suddenly you're negotiating tariffs and rules of origin with the people who used to be your neighbors. You're not the only game in town, everybody. Other provinces and buyers have options.
And that's before we even touch passports, border crossings, airlines, airspace, defense, intelligence sharing, all that stuff. These separatists are out there promising freedom, and they haven't even worked out whether you'd need customs between Calgary and Vancouver.
That's where the Puerto Rico comparison comes in, because Washington has already told these separatists that U.S. statehood is basically impossible. The Senate is not going to vote and add a new state that would immediately demand equal power.
No, what's left on the table is the kind of status where you send your young people to fight in U.S. wars, you use U.S. currency, you follow U.S. federal law, but you don't get full representation. You're subject to decisions that you don't even control. Now, let's look at why Washington is so interested in this. Let's bring in our old friend from the U.S. Treasury, Scott Bessent, the guy who has turned gaslighting into a full-time job description.
This is the same U.S. Treasury Secretary who's been telling Americans everything is fine while their dollar tumbles and gold shoots through the roof. He's the one who dismissed Mark Carney's Davos speech as grandstanding, while investors, they quietly started hedging against exactly the risk Carney was talking about.
And out of all the provinces in Canada, who does he single out as a natural partner for the U.S.? Alberta. Right as separatists are flying down to Washington, pitching their breakup fantasy and bragging about meetings at the highest levels of the U.S. government.
Carney's been pushing for a Team Canada approach to trade since he got into office. He's had monthly meetings with premiers, a new major projects office to fast-track national building infrastructure, including a pipeline that moves Alberta energy to the Pacific, without turning the province into an American dependency.
And that's the core divide here. On one side, you have a prime minister and a majority of premiers trying to walk into the next round of North America trade talks as a united front. On the other, you have a premier who refuses to condemn people walking into the U.S. State Department to ask, so, how would you feel about an independent Alberta?
And that brings us back to Danielle Smith, because this is where leadership matters. Nobody's asking her to pretend that Albertans aren't frustrated. The federal government did fail Alberta in the past.
But leadership is the ability to look at your own base in the eye and say, hey, there is a line that we do not cross. We do not go to foreign governments and ask them to help us break up the country. We do not turn treaties into bargaining chips. We do not encourage people to sign onto a petition that could drag this province into a constitutional and legal disaster.
We need to be clear about the stakes. If you're organizing meetings with foreign governments to discuss breaking up Canada, well, that just isn't asking questions or doing research. That crosses into national security territory, and it needs proper investigation, it needs transparency, and it needs consequences.
We also have to stop letting a loud minority pretend that they speak for an entire province. Between 70 and 80% of Albertans do not support independence. An even bigger majority doesn't even want a referendum on it. The same is true in Quebec right now. The separatist parties are loud, but most people just want a country that works. So here's our message to everybody today. To Albertans who are angry, who feel ignored, who want a better deal. You are not the enemy. You are not the problem. You deserve a government in Edmonton and in Ottawa that fights for you without putting a for sale sign on the entire province.
But to the separatist organizers flying to Washington, shopping around a $500 billion loan, and joking about Alberta as America's new favorite toy, that's not loving Alberta. That's selling out your own country to line your own pockets. In a word, it's treason.
And to Danielle Smith, it really is as simple as Doug Ford put it between slices of pizza. Either you're with Canada or you're not.
Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, especially if you're in Alberta. Do you think the Premier should clearly denounce the separatist movement in any back-channel meetings with the USA and Washington?
And if you found this helpful, hit like so more Canadians can see it. And subscribe for more sanity checks north of the madness. Ring the bell so you don't miss what Trump and his friends try next. And if you want to support deeper dives like this, consider joining the A-Team or checking out our Substack in the description.
Don't forget that we've got merch for sale to show your Canadian pride, because Canada is never going to be the 51st state. So thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.